opening up the diagonal for your king's bishop, immediately contests the center and hints at attacking intentions. Instantly staking a claim to the d4 square, this Sicilian defense creates fascinating imbalances. Initiating a pawn chain prepares a central pawn push, aiming for space and potentially opening lines for bishops later. Boldly seizing central space, d5 challenges white's pawn structure and opens critical diagonals for black's bishops. Liberating the d-file now is a double-edged sword, potentially opening lines for bishops. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen immediately develops a piece and contests the center, but risks exposing her to early harassment. Opening the center dramatically, white aims to exploit black's misplaced queen and sees a lead in development. Solidifying central control and preparing for knight development, this move opens a diagonal for the queen's bishop. Knight emerges, developing a piece and reinforcing the d4 pawn's central control. Developing the knight to its natural square, this piece will soon contest the central tension and prepare for castling. Developing the bishop to a square where it supports the center and prepares for kingside castling, offers solid development. Fulfilling its role, the bishop now retreats to safety, preparing for the inevitable castling to come. Asserting central dominance and creating queenside pressure, this pawn push bravely contests key squares and prepares to expand. Retreating the queen to d8 forfeits central influence and allows white to seize initiative, potentially leading to queenside pressure. Anchoring the king safely allows white to focus on developing an attacking formation. Opening the c-file now allows for active piece play and challenges white's central pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn with the knight immediately solidifies the center, preparing to activate pieces and potentially pressure black's slightly awkward queen placement. Safeguarding the monarch initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, preparing for potential central advances by white. Repositioning the knight to a more active square prepares for future pawn advances and central control. a6 aims to secure space on the queen side, preventing a potential nc3b5 advance. Unblocking the bishop now allows it to eye the queen side and potentially target the pawn structure, creating a subtle pressure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while preparing to develop the bishop to a more active square. Elevating the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing for a potential queenside expansion and eyeing potential weaknesses around black's king. Pressing the knight toward the queen side eyes the central dark squares, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. Repositioning the bishop to f3 allows for a more active control of the central squares and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the king side. Relocating the queen to b6 offers better central influence while eyeing the queen side for potential pressure. Centralizing the queen prepares to contest the d4 square and adds pressure to black's queenside pawn structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to contest the d-file, this move quietly develops a piece. Securing the b-file, this move begins a silent pressure campaign, eyeing potential pawn advances on the queen side and subtly preparing for pawn structure adjustments. A strategic pawn advance, aiming to gain queenside space and disrupt white's knight outpost, though it concedes the b5 square. Opening the d-file allows white to challenge black's central control and potentially exert pressure on the d-pawn. Asserting control of the open c-file now forces white to confront the pressure directly, rather than simply developing. Prioritizing queen activity, white seeks to activate her onto a more dynamic square. Reclaiming the central e-file for counterplay, this prepares for active piece play and potential attacks against white's kingside. Unleashing the knight to probe for weaknesses, aiming to exploit the cramped queen side and disrupt black's coordination. Shattering white's intended queenside expansion, this bishop boldly claims outpost territory, igniting a positional duel. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure secures territory and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Sacrificing the bishop simplifies the pawn structure, potentially freeing black's queenside while opening lines for counterplay. Recapturing with the queen reclaims central influence, though it also draws it into potentially exposed lines. A bold repositioning aiming to secure the queen on a more active diagonal, potentially setting up future pressure along the open c-file. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, creating a favorable endgame scenario by leveraging the open d-file for initiative. Simplifying to an endgame where black secures the semi-open c-file and exerts pressure. Solidifying the pawn structure now aims to prevent black from exploiting the open files and prepares for a potential kingside advance. Steering the king to a safer square amidst the material exchange, aiming to bolster its defenses and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Securing the king's escape route, a sensible prophylactic measure against potential diagonal threats as the game simplifies. Securing the d-file with the rook will pressure white's central pawns and prepare for potential endgame advantages. Seizing control of the c7 square establishes a powerful outpost, threatening to disrupt black's harmony. Sacrificing the rook on d1 offers a slight reprieve, momentarily freeing the d-file for piece repositioning and potentially disrupting white's pawn structure before the inevitable endgame. Regaining the rook immediately establishes central file dominance and prepares for an active endgame. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, black seeks to disrupt white's defensive setup and gain some breathing room. Propping open the b-file, white reclaims initiative, seeking to exploit the pawn's advanced position before black consolidates. Seizing the open file is crucial, creating immediate pressure on the isolated d3 pawn. Recapturing on the file solidifies white's pawn structure, though it does open the b-file for black's rook. Repositioning the knight to the e8 square offers a subtle defensive maneuver, potentially preparing for a kingside pawn push or reinforcing the central pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop onto the long diagonal opens up attacking possibilities and pressures black's pawn structure. This redeployment aims to activate the knight, potentially eyeing central squares and creating dynamic play. Exchanging bishops simplifies the structure, potentially opening a path for the rook on the d-file. Reclaiming the central square with the bishop solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for future piece activity. Opening the queenside flank now creates opportunities to infiltrate with the rook, potentially exploiting the exposed king. The knight's journey to the edge of the board secures a breathing space, though it sacrifices outpost potential for now. Recapturing the knight opens a clear diagonal for the queen to potentially infiltrate the weakened queenside. Reclaiming the open file immediately after the exchange is paramount. Asserting central dominance, this knight repositions to control the crucial d6 square, preparing for potential pawn advances. Centralizing the rook immediately activates it, eyeing weakened pawns and potential sacrifices. Exploiting the queen's absence, this pawn push aims to expand space on the queenside and restrict black's knight. A bold attempt to disrupt white's queenside majority, but it concedes valuable space and allows white to consolidate further. Opening the c-file seizes control, aiming to crack open black's stubbornly defended position and exploit the weak pawns. Aggressively challenging the central pawn structure, this move opens a dynamic path for the knight and introduces critical pressure. Pivoting the knight to g5 creates immediate threats to black's vulnerable kingside pawn structure. Reactivating the king's activity is key to navigating this complex pawn structure and potential endgame. Shifting the rook to the open file establishes central control and pressures black's weakened pawn structure. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside to disrupt white's cramped position and open attacking avenues. A bold knight sacrifice clears the path for a devastating rook penetration towards the black king. Exposing the king further now that the rooks have cleared the way invites immediate danger from the vigilant knight. Activating the rook onto the 8th rank immediately threatens the enemy king and creates a dangerous mating net. Navigating this complex rook and pawn endgame, the knight's repositioning prepares to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. Sacrificing the knight here exposes the enemy monarch to a powerful attack, creating immediate tactical opportunities. Relocating the king to the wing exposes it to a direct attack on the weakened kingside. Striking at the pinned knight severs black's defense and opens a decisive path. Opening the central files now cedes crucial tempo and allows white's monarch to escape its current bind. This pawn push reclaims material and opens a critical avenue for your rook. Embracing the sacrificed pawn now presents a dangerous open road for your king, demanding immediate defensive positioning to avoid further concessions. The rook relentlessly drives to the 8th rank, aiming to exploit the exposed king and open files. Sacrificing the knight opened a swift path to the black king, now exposed and vulnerable to the advancing pawns. Opening the c-file decisively claims a critical open highway for your rooks to penetrate. Exploring the potential of the newly opened c-file and the exposed monarch's plight. Initiating a decisive attack on the weakened kingside, leveraging the open files. Sacrificing the exchange to simplify and gain an active rook is a bold attempt to salvage a lost position. Activating the rook on the open file now eliminates black's last pawn, simplifying towards a winning rook endgame.